and start with a story. So January 2017, the regional leadership team of Westfield Mall called an emergency team meeting. The reason for this call, the reason for the emergency team meeting is that tenants on the 4th floor of their downtown San Francisco City Center Mall were moving out. As they dug into the data and started talking with the tenants, one of the things that they discovered is that despite the fact that the 4th floor boasted panoramic views of the city and had beautiful fresco ceilings painted to boot, yet tenants were moving out because very few customers were actually coming to the 4th floor of the mall. And they couldn't afford to continue renting there. And so the management team of Westfield convened a meeting to address this looming crisis. And the question of the meeting is effectively, how do we drive customer foot traffic to the 4th floor? They called in the brightest minds from marketing and real estate operations and legal and compliance, and they put all their cognitive effort on this challenge. How do we drive traffic to the 4th floor? Otherwise, we're not going to have the kind of rent revenues we need. And in a downtown urban city center, we can't afford to have tenants moving out of such a premier real estate. So I think Perry's posted in the chat there questions. What would you put on the 4th floor? And this team engaged in a rigorous brainstorm. Most research suggests that many brainstorms never exceed 2 ideas in total output.
Yeah,
and you can imagine.
You just broke through. Awesome.
We just got more than 2. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah. All kinds, live music, food courts, signage.
An M&M stop.
Oh, wood-fired hot tub spa center. Signals, I love it.
Crypto.
A surprise daily. That's a good idea. There's so many good ideas. Scavenger hunt, free drinks, puppy cuddling. There we go. Outlets, loads of ideas. I wish you were on the team for
puppy cuddling. Puppy cuddling.
Ideas.
All right, so suffice it to say, this brainstorm that we just engaged in 10 minutes probably explored, I would say undoubtedly explored a much broader and more radical territory than the territory the Westfield team explored. And if you think about why, it makes a lot of sense, right? They're concerned with implementability. They're concerned with feasibility. They're concerned with addressing the problem quickly and doing something that's in their wheelhouse, right? And so even the breadth of their divergence was probably constrained somewhat. But one of the ideas that rose to the surface, and an idea, or that rose to the top of the heap, so to speak, and an idea that we thought wasn't that bad, was the idea of putting a beer garden in the 4th floor. And as the team heard that idea, and as they started kind of spitballing what it could look like, everybody got intoxicated or entranced with this idea of a bunch of Silicon Valley startup founders, ascending the 4th floor like Greek gods at Mount Olympus, sipping ambrosia, looking over the cityscape views, and everybody started feeling a little intoxicated at the possibilities. But the question still persists. How do we know if this is a good idea? We have an idea, and we can speak about, and we already have to some degree in the former talks, the kind of volume required to get to a good idea and the kind of divergence needed to get to a good idea. But assuming you get any idea, the question still remains, should we invest resources in this particular direction? And how do we know whether we should invest resources in this particular direction? The team at Westfield had to answer this question first. And so what they did is they sent an army of interns and employees to the 1st floor where there was already a food court. And they interviewed people, and they had clipboards in hand, and they started asking people, if we, Mount Olympus, picture this, we got a vision, we have a dream. If we put a beer garden on the 4th floor, would you come? Would you check it out? And they talked to not just a few people, they talked to 1,000 people. These are actual human beings who visit this exact location. And they talked to a lot of them. And you know what the response was? It was, you may not be surprised to discover this, it was overwhelmingly positive. Over 80% of people who they surveyed said, if you build it, we will come, so to speak. That'd be amazing. I'd love to view the cityscape with a, frothy IPA in hand. It sounds amazing, right? And so armed with this trove of data and enthusiastic also about the possibilities, the idea and how it appealed to them individually and how imminently implementable it was. It drew upon existing capabilities and resources, et cetera. The Westfield team charged ahead with building out a pretty beautiful 4th floor beer garden. It took a few months, obviously, but once they built it out, the executive team that had commissioned the effort enthusiastically awaited the results. And when they finally got the data back, they found out less than they expected visited. About 10 people visited, but surely that's 10 people a day, right? As they discovered, it was actually 10 people total over more than a month had ascended the Mount Olympus, so to speak, to visit the beer garden. And they were devastated. They invested a great deal of energy and resources and their hope in this idea, actually. And we see that happen a lot. Many times, an idea is implemented, and if the data doesn't bear out, the team's okay with it. But the problem often is, that was our billion-dollar idea. That was our good idea. And we invested a lot of money in expecting it to work. And when the Westfield team came to us, they came to invite us to contribute to a post-mortem of sorts, where we unpacked what were the cognitive barriers, flaws, procedural mistakes that were made that allowed them to make such a monumental mistake, such an expensive and costly mistake. And what could they do? Because they not only they had the 4th floor problem in San Francisco, but they had a host of other problems that they realized if they continued to employ the standard means of generating ideas, evaluating ideas, and implementing ideas, they were likely to encounter costly failures again. So they came to us with this question: what do we do differently? And that's what brings us to the subject at hand in this 3rd Masters of Creativity talk.
Oh. Gosh, I feel like we're in like a David Fincher film. We start off with like the kind of, crazy scene with the story that's just fraught with peril. So, hopefully we created the suspense. And as we move forward, we'll talk about and give practical examples of experimentation. So in topic number 3 for this series, we're going to cover experimentation, which in the chat, I love some of the people, and Damra, you were saying exactly that. It's not what people say, it's what people do. And how do you discreetly and quickly get some practical input? And that's what we want to talk about. And this example is a great one about sort of what happens if you rely too much on things that I think get conflated with experimentation. And we'll get into that later. So with that, the last topic is updating your creative operating system. That's what it's gonna be. This is very much like us writing these chapters that kind of we're figuring out on the fly. So we don't know exactly what's in that talk, but you will be the first to know if you come on the 29th. With that, we've got a rubric for today, a little structure. So we're going to talk about the why, the what, the when, the which, and the how of experimentation, and ask you for some. We're watching the clock here. We're going to ask you for some questions a little way along, so we can also spend a little bit of time making sure we connect this content with the practical questions you have.
So we want to dive into the why first. And as we've already described, the why primarily for experimentation is because failure is expensive, or to say it differently, normal failures are expensive. And this isn't a new phenomenon. It was experienced with Westfield. It's been experienced recently with Intel and their $750 billion failure with their video conferencing product. But it's an age-old problem. It dates back a long way. But one of our favorite stories actually comes from some of the early days in Bell Labs. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this product. It's called the Picture Phone. And it was debuted at the World's Fair in 1964. And it actually enabled users of the device to see one another. It's like FaceTime, but 50 years ago. And Bell Labs pioneered this product and used the World's Fair as an unveiling moment for it. They were so enthusiastic about people's response at the World's Fair. They did some surveys. They asked people what they thought and whether they would buy it, similar to what we heard with Westfield. And the response was so overwhelmingly positive that Jim Fisk, who's the president of Bell Labs at the time, made a statement that he said, there are naysayers out there, but just like people naysayed Alexander Graham Bell when he invented the telephone, which had become obviously a phenomenal success, those same criticisms are going to seem like the criticisms of the phone in the future. Within just a couple of years, they had to confess that they had less than 100 units in operation around the United States, and all of the enthusiasm and demand that they had projected at the World's Fair didn't really materialize. So experimentation is a means by which organizations can avoid these expensive and embarrassing failures. But even more than that, I would say experimentation is the means by which organizations discover amazing things worth doing. There's a great example of Oregon University's track coach, Bill Bowerman. He was also the US Olympic track coach as well. But Bill Bowerman was obsessed with helping his athletes perform at elite levels in the university setting. And a lot of people hear the story. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the founding of Nike. He and Phil Knight founded Nike together. But one of the pivotal, insightful, kind of lightning bolt eureka moments happened when Bill Bowerman is sitting at his kitchen table watching his wife make breakfast. And as she's peeling the waffle off of the waffle iron, you know what he thought? This is a true story. That's what I could put on the bottom of a shoe. And he actually grabbed the waffle iron, takes it in the garage, and starts pouring different mixes of rubber effectively into the waffle iron. He destroyed it quickly, but that set him on a radically different path and set Nike on almost an asymptotic trajectory of growth. What's interesting is we can think, how do I prepare myself for lightning to strike? I mean, Bill Bowerman, was he lucky? And what we'd say is no. What we know from history is that for years, he was painstakingly altering his athletes' shoes at the University of Oregon. Phil Knight jokes in his book, Shoe Dog, that you never knew if your shoes were going to be made out of cod skin or kangaroo leather, whether he was going to remove something of the upper or add something, where there would be cuts on your shoes and where there'd be cuts on your feet at the end of the race. But Bowerman always kept two notebooks. He kept a notebook of his athletes' performance, and he kept a notebook of his shoe modification performance. And he was maniacal about improving the performance of the footwear of the athletes he was trying to coach. And so that's actually, it's that mode of experimentation and focus on experimentation that actually prepared Bill Bowerman to receive the inspiration of the waffle iron in that moment. And it's not magic, and it's not a fluke that inspiration strikes people like that. We like to say inspiration strikes the wood shop. And if you do the work of experimentation, if you do the work of trying and tinkering, a lot of times that's the necessary cognitive preparation for inspiration to strike. So experimentation is very important to prepare an innovator for the good ideas that will follow, not the good ideas even maybe that you're experimenting on presently.
And the next topic is what to experiment on. So, and I would say it's, we have a sense of the order of operations. And if you think about the what, usually people tackle all of these aspects. Oh, the one thing, just an aside, you know, an MBA in like minutes, these diagrams, you know, in these multiple circles in the intersection, you always want to have your idea or whatever innovation resides between all these things.
Right there.
Yeah, right there. And it's like a 2x2. It's awesome. Your thing's always up and to the right. Your thing's always in the middle. Anyway, putting these three things together, in this case, you could have other aspects, but for sake of argument, it's feasibility, viability, and desirability. And a lot of times teams or individuals approach experiments with, oh, I want to do the whole thing at once. If I have an idea, I got to test the whole idea. In the case of Westfield, they got this idea for a beer garden. How do I test the entire idea and concept of a beer garden? And what we want to talk about is where to start. And where to start is with desirability and ask a different question. If it is feasible, if it is viable as a business, viability means could it actually make money? Could it actually work economically, whether for profit or non-profit? Is it actually going to get people to come? Feasibility, can we do it? Desirability is, do people want to do it? Is this actually desirable to them? And we think asking the question, would it matter if I put all the effort into building this thing? Would people care? Would they come? That's the question to ask first, and then do an experiment just on that aspect. And that takes a little bit of a different mindset of saying, how do I, and somebody said earlier, how do I see if somebody would just take a simple discrete action and move forward and actually be interested in this concept? So we'll tell a very, very brief story here. We worked many years ago, we had a student, and some of the students, Signo was one I noticed in here, from a class D leadership at Stanford. And we had some folks from corporate environment come in, and one of them was Erica Walsh. She worked at that time for Bridgestone Tires here in the US in Indianapolis. And she did all kinds of work with design thinking, did this leadership class, and then went back and led a team through a process, working around how would Bridgestone design some new services. So tires were a commodity business. They needed to do ancillary services. What are other transportation services we can consider offering? Had a brainstorm session. One of the post-its had this idea for a tread alert system. That's what this says on that tiny popsicle stick. And this idea was one of the ones they selected. And they went on and said, okay, well, interesting. We did a quick prototype of this. What if it's a sensor? People can drive up on their car and they get an indication of their tire wear. Okay, so they built this quick prototype. They could have gone and thought about, okay, in that rubric, how would we build this? Oh my God, how many sensors would be involved? How much would it cost? What would be the liability? Feasibility. Viability, do people pay for it? Do our dealers buy the machine from us? Is there a licensing? Like, how do we make it viable for us? Instead, they started with that desirability piece and said, would people take action? Would people be interested in this at all? Let's figure out if it has any value to the end consumer. And see, therefore, we'd have some conviction to go forward, some conviction to spend more time on it, which to me is the primary purpose of experimentation. So they went out and that evening bought a bunch of bath mats from Target. So they spent about $14. This is a true story. It's $14. They have the receipt still on bath mats. Luckily, they're a tire company, so they had some tire chocks, these things that people could drive up and bump up against. And they made a sign just with Sharpies and pen and said, hey, Bridgestone tread alert system available today. They went to a local mall near their office in Indianapolis and had an individual from the team put some text messages into their phone and basically had people, they tracked how many people just drove by and didn't pay attention to the sign, how many people were willing to pull in. The individual there in the picture went up and said, hey, this is this new tread alert system. Would you like to have the tread measured on your tires? Great. Can I have your mobile phone number? Because the system will text you an answer to this. And they basically had canned text messages and they would try them out on people. And, some would say, hey, your tread is fine, drive on. The next one would say, hey, your tread is worn. Here's what you need to do about it. But they would always check the tires and say, hey, the system's not that accurate. Let me actually check your tread wear. So they didn't defraud people and send them off without getting some actual advice on what they need to do about the tires. But they were able to get all kinds of data. How many people drove into the stall? What was their reaction when they got the information? And they learned loads in this case. This became a service, but they learned loads about how simple the service actually needed to be. People didn't drive around caring about their tire wear. What they wanted to know essentially was, is it something really, really important I should be paying attention to? And if it is, what do I do about this in the immediate future? So that's what they learned from this test. And they learned, oh, wow, that's what's desirable. Thank God we didn't build this whole system and worry about too much about it. It's kind of a very simple sensor that just is going to alert people if it's truly an impending challenge. And that allowed them to move with a quick, discrete experiment, several hours of people's time, very low expense, to just isolate the desirability variable and see if would people take action? Do they care about this feature?
It's really important to mention this because so many times what we observe is that if you ask an individual or a team to conduct an experiment, they almost always default to feasibility. Can we make it? And we've sat in on so many office hours across the university and so many startup and accelerator and incubator type environments inside of organizations. Almost always people start with a feasibility question, and almost always it's not that it's not important. You ultimately have to be able to deliver the technological function, but oftentimes it's a really expensive question to answer. And it ignores a more important question, which is, if we built it, would people actually want it? And if we grow in conviction, wow, people really want this, by all means, let's deploy the resources needed to figure out, in the Bridgestone example, measuring down to the nanometer is actually really important, but it's only if the function is desirable in the user's life. So the other aspect of experimentation, Perry, I think you were going to mention, was this question of when to experiment.
And so a great question. One is that I thought the question about, what about other aspects? So the three circles, we've seen a couple organizations now add in one for impact. There's a fourth, meaning what impact, what good will this do? So this might be something like, we actually want to, I know in the case of Bridgestone, they actually want to make a huge impact on safety. So I know that was something that they found also motivated teams to test desirability, impact, viability, and finally feasibility. In terms of the when, we've talked about this in other aspects. And the when is the story that Jeremy was talking about. The when is early. The when is, how do you move smaller, more discrete experiments earlier? So lower cost, fast. The fact that the Bridgestone group did the experiment, I think one of them went to Target the evening after the brainstorm and they went out the next day. That's the kind of fast cycle. And I'm sure that we actually should have checked with Erica. I'm sure they tested a lot of things that day with the same level of fidelity. So they found really simple ways to discreetly test these things, and they did them early. So the thing that's maybe obvious is, and I'm sure people have been I've been in organizations, maybe a lot of you have, where you wait and launch. And we have all this marketing effort, all this stuff, all these hypotheses, and they all get tested the day of the launch, as opposed to, how do you release things earlier? In my career, I worked at a company, Patagonia, a clothing company, and we started to do some soft launches of things. We would put things in a retail store for a day or two and just watch and see what would happen before we would launch this big effort around a product, and just see how people would react to it and see if it was desirable and get feedback. And I think the example of Bridgestone is they put something really rough in front of their consumers early. It wasn't sorted out. And it's, the story is one of success there, but I'm sure there were prototypes they tested that day that bombed, and then great, you just gained all that free time. You don't have to worry about that idea that's fourth or fifth on your list. You can focus on the ones that did get resonance with consumers.
The other thing that's important about when to experiment is, most of the time, certainly early in the life of a project, the other time that we've observed it's really useful to think about experimentation as an activity is when a team finds themselves discussing, and a meeting ends with a resolution to have another meeting, right? I don't know if others have experienced that, but anytime the meeting ends and you go, gosh, we got to talk about this more, our question is, will there be new information? And in most cases, no, we don't have enough information to make a decision, in which case experimentation is the means by which the team creates the information to bring to the next conversation. And a lot of times we see teams, I see this all the time with executive teams, they kick big decisions down the road. And what I would say is, if you're going to kick a decision down the road, at least commission a set of experiments so that you have new information when you get to that spot down the road. So the other thing we want to say is which Signo, your son is precious, by the way. Hi. So the other thing I want to talk about is which of our ideas should we be experimenting on? There are lots of ideas that teams are coming up with, but then experiments take a little bit more time. And how do you know which experiment you should, which concept or idea you should choose to commission experiments behind? And one of the things that we have observed is organizations get incredibly detailed and complex around selecting ideas. They have EBITDA matrices, and they have NPV calculations. They have value against capabilities. There's all sorts of great ways to do it. Very simply, though, our belief is you should only experiment with something if you're excited to know the outcome. We call this trusting your aha-meter, so to speak. You have this internal sense. If you're not excited about the possibility of something new in the world, by all means, don't experiment with it. And we find many teams fail because of the lack of that initial spark that they need to actually endure the uncertainty and the ambiguity and the misdirections that accompany an experimental approach. And so our position is you should have a sense of excitement and wonder and possibility. If you feel that way about an idea, then say, okay, let's focus on the desirability of that idea. A lot of times we see in tech organizations out here, especially, teams get excited about the possibility of a new technology. Think Google Glass, think the Segway, and they don't really think about desirability. So even if you're excited about a technology, think deliberately as a team about how do we test the desirability of this new idea. But if you're not excited about it, don't bother with anything else, because there's any robust creative practice. The problem is actually about the volume of ideas. It's not about, we don't have any more good ones. It's about which ones do we resource and which ones do we focus on. And our hunch is if your team's not excited, keep moving down the funnel.
So we want to talk for a moment, getting back to the Westfield example. What could Westfield have done to experiment? Given what limited equipping we've given, just drop in chat ideas you have for what experiment could they have done. With their fourth floor, they have this idea. They have an idea. Given the starting point, they have this idea of a beer garden. Host a beer garden pop-up. Low-cost pop-up. How would you do a low cost? How would you do an almost no cost pop-up? Cardboard, now we're getting it, Jamie. Kegs and chairs, love it. Yeah, just you guys are taking all the cost out of it. Get down to the, what do they do that's almost a no cost method? Signage directing people upstairs. Kelly, bingo. It's if you're really testing, will people take action? A great experiment might have been just putting a sign by the elevator to the fourth floor, seeing, as Westfield did, how many people pass the sign, how many people push the button for the fourth floor. And then, we just put Jeremy up on the fourth floor with a pitcher, a pitcher of beer. So you're not lying to him.
And a succulent of some kind. So it's technically a garden. It's beer in a garden. Anybody who comes up, I'm ready to service you, right? But what would I learn quickly?
You learn if people take action. And I think that was something way early we got in the chat was you want to test and have conviction around the action they take. It's very different to ask somebody, hey, Karen, Nick, Linda, Bridget, what would you do a couple of weeks from now for lunch? Would you come to a beer garden? And it's very different to say, wow, it's lunch right now. There's a beer garden open. Come on upstairs. And what they found was so many people that had said yes in the survey, or their reaction was no. It's a working day. I can't come back to my office, smelling like beer. Contrary to all the hype about these offices that have kegs of beer on tap all day. Yeah, usually they aren't at noon, where they're trying to get them all filled. But to me, great examples of discrete experimentation. And the idea is, how do we sort of take all the work out and just leave the fact, can we get a sense of some data around that desirability? Will people take action? Will they just push the button for the elevator, push the fourth floor, and then we'll measure how many do that out of how many pass the sign?
When we're interacting with founders in the context of Launchpad, we run the accelerator at the D.school, which is called Launchpad. And one of the things we ask students to do is formulate what we call an innovator's hypothesis, where it's just 4 simple Post-its. And if it gets more complicated than this, you're probably being taken advantage of. It should not be complicated, right? But it's who's the person whose life you're trying to impact? What's the specific pain they're experiencing? What's the pain-killing feature that you plan to deliver? And what's something that you could do in 2 hours to see whether delivering that feature mitigates that pain for that person? It's very, very simple. And we use pain deliberately, right? Because for a lot of, to use a simple metaphor, people forget to take their vitamins. They don't forget to take their painkillers. And there's a lot of products that you can conceive of that are really nice to have. It's like my 1-a-day multivitamin that's been like, it's probably expired in my cupboard because I just never remember to take my multivitamin. But my Tylenol, when I've got a headache, I've never said, oh man, I forgot to take Tylenol. And the point is, addressing someone's pain engages them in a way that delivering something that'd be really nice for them to have almost never does. And so in the early stages, we invite you to frame your experiments and your new ideas in terms of the pain they address, because it will help you focus the type of person you're looking for. You say, many people don't feel that pain. We say, great, you can actually find them. You can actually see whether your solution addresses their pain, right? Most people think about experimentation similar to how they think about a VC pitch deck or something. It's for everybody. It does everything, right? And we're constantly trying to just gather people back and go, no, it can't be for everybody. No, it can't do everything. Who's the one person it's for? What's the one thing it does for them? And if you're really, really focused, you'll learn quickly. And it's likely that your point of focus is actually incorrect. That doesn't mean that focusing is wrong. Focusing is what enables you to really quickly eliminate hypotheses that are wrong. And if you remain unfocused, you have no way of quickly moving and quickly learning. So we advocate even 2 hours. It doesn't mean necessarily that it takes 2 hours to gather the data, but what we would suggest is if you're going to commission experiment, you should be able to prop up everything you need to do so that data can be collected within 2 hours. And if it takes a lot longer than that, especially as it pertains to desirability, then you should think about reducing the scope and scale of what you're doing so that you can be very focused. The other thing that we would say is don't expect to get it right the first time. Does anybody know why WD-40 is called WD-40? It's what happens when you let engineers do branding. It's water displacement 40. That's what WD-40 stands for. And what it means is that a well-funded team with a very clearly defined problem required 40 attempts to get the formulation right. And it's very important to realize that this is actually about cycles. Experimentation is about cycles. And most teams we see, they get disappointed if they get it wrong early. And what we say is, no, that's just another lap around the track. And you need to expect you're going to be taking many laps. If you have the expectation, I'm going to do it once and it's going to be perfect, that's not really experimentation. And teams that have a sense for, we're just running laps. And what constitutes a lap when it pertains to desirability? You have to include the end user in the interaction. No amount of research is a lap if it doesn't include the end user. Last week, part of our team was actually in Chicago. We were working with an internal team of innovators at a company, and we gave an experimentation assignment. Over half of the employees in the company who had 2 hours to do an experiment came back with research. Mm-hmm. I'm all for research. I love it. I posted my reading list. I love reading. That's fine. Research is not experimentation. And it's important, we can value both of them, but to recognize when we are advocating for an experimental approach to data creation, we're not advocating a research approach to data discovery. And what experimentation does is it enables you to create data that no one else in the world has or can find, because you have scoped the experiment uniquely and you have executed it in a very personal and specific way. And that kind of proprietary data is the kind of data that you need in the early stages to grow in conviction that any one particular direction is the right direction to go in. But this cycle, we would say, is really critical. You craft an experiment, you deploy the experiment, and then you gather data. And then from the data, you assess and you iterate to redeploy a new experiment. And one side note here, I'll just mention this in passing. Before you evaluate the idea, whatever idea you're experimenting with, you ought to evaluate the experiment. Because many times experiments are designed in such a way that they yield data that can be misleading. I'll give you a simple example. I was working with a team at a pizza shop recently. They had an idea around improving the recovery rate when orders get messed up through third-party deliverers. So DoorDash or Uber Eats, they deliver your food. As a customer, you have a relationship with DoorDash. You don't have a relationship with the pizzeria. And they were trying to figure out, how do we make it right if we mess up an order? Because they call DoorDash and DoorDash throws us under the bus and it's not cool. What do we do? And so they decided to put in cards in every DoorDash order saying, hi, my name is Jeremy. I personally packed your lunch or your dinner or whatever. Please text me on my mobile phone. And they gave their mobile number if anything's wrong. So they put this in 23 bags one night. We come back the next day, we say, hey, let's collect the data. How many people wrote you back? They go, none. You know, it's a bad idea. Next idea. And we go, whoa, hey, hang on a second. Let's talk about it. What do you mean nobody wrote you back? Nobody. We put notes in 23 bags. And I can't claim any particular genius here, but somehow over the course of the conversation, the fact emerged that because of the level of scrutiny in the kitchen, each bag was checked like 5 times by different people to make sure the order was perfect. So is it any surprise that nobody reached out saying their order was messed up? No, right? So you go, okay, 0 for 23 people reach out. That seems like bad data, but if you examine the experiment, what you learn is we should have been messing up orders. If we want to find out if people want to engage, we should be making them wrong. And the point is, before you declare success or failure with an idea, it's really useful to go through this process of actually examining the experiment to make sure that the data that you created is actually telling you what you want to know. And it's not always obvious, and you don't have to get it right, but if you get in the habit as a team of reviewing not only the data, but also how the experiment was deployed and what the data that it creates actually tells you, you learn an enormous amount, not only about new ideas, but also about your craft and your ability to quickly assess the quality of ideas. And that's really what great innovation, or great innovative organizations do. Perry, you want to talk about Netflix?
Oh, go ahead. I'm just getting some great stuff up, chat. I want to gather for the end here.
Oh, cool, great. So one of our friend Signo, who's actually here on the call right now, tipped me off to Tim Ferriss's interview with Mark Randolph, who's the co-founder of Netflix, along with Reed Hastings. And I loved this point. Thank you, Signo. I can finally thank you in public, in a public forum. And we'll leave this in the YouTube recording as well. So your contribution will be preserved for posterity. But what Mark Randolph talked about is fascinating, is they had to build a system to really quickly test lots of bad ideas. He has a belief there's no such thing as a good idea. And in the early days, they tested things like customized shampoo, for different hair types. So they had a team of chemists, no kidding, and customized dog food for different geographies and activity levels. They were trying all sorts of stuff. But the point is, they really mastered an experimentation cycle where he said early on, it took us 2 weeks to deploy an experiment. And we'd make it beautiful and it would all be perfect. But then it took us 2 weeks to learn we had a bad idea. So he said, then Reed and I said, okay, can we get it down to a week where we learn if we have a good idea in just a week? And then we got it down to every other day. Then we got it down to every day. And he said, now we're deploying 4 or 5 experiments a day. But the point is, this experimentation capacity and capability is actually a key differentiator. And when it comes down to how to experiment, one thing is, how do I learn if I have a good idea? Because I really like this idea and I really want to launch it. That's great. But don't be so idea fixated that you miss what's really important to us, which is around a capability, developing the ability to learn on a repeated basis, whether the ideas that are coming to you are worth pursuing. So anyway, that's the what, why, when, which, how, who, etc. We want to start to address some of the questions that are in chat. Our hope was to create a little bit of space here, and we got about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to skip the remainder of the slides so that we can get to questions. Perry, do you have a few queued up?
Yeah. I thought, Bernice, thanks for clarifying on the question you asked, because it's a terrific one about if you're working with a team or leadership and you have conviction, I want to test around desirability, like let's figure out if people would want this idea, and there's not a lot of uptake on that. I think one of the diagnoses we've had in teams or organizations is a lot of times teams are approaching a problem with the preconceived concept, this is what we do. So an example just recently came to mind as in a couple days ago. We had out of that program Launchpad, we've mentioned a little bit, the accelerator, and we have a few founders. Krish, I saw you in here, who's a this year founder. We have one of the founders from Launchpad 2 or 3 or 4, so maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, started a company Fellow, which is a coffee equipment company. So you maybe have seen their stuff. It's super nice equipment, and they've been really, really successful. And they make coffee making equipment for people that really care about their flavor, care about making a great cup of coffee, and that's what they do. So as they've started paying attention to their customers and getting a lot bigger, they certainly sort of have the category map, like we need to do something for espresso, we need to do something for a French press, we need to, you know, so they've got the categories and we want to improve on these. But as they talk to their customers, they were learning a lot about a lot of interesting desirability input around what type of coffee to buy, you know, and what are the differences and how do I, you know, sort of figure out how to navigate all this. And they, you know, it's hard to get a company to take a look at something that's not their core competency. It's not, it doesn't involve bill of materials. It doesn't involve, you know, getting a design done, marketing it, fitting it on the website. And they decided to do this quick test, which is they put together an SMS-based, a text-based service that would basically allow people to experience some new types of coffees really quickly if they wanted to, with really clear opportunities to do so. And I know they're just doing this kind of out of the office with people packing up coffees that they run out and grab from local suppliers, and seeing if there's an uptake, seeing what people do with it, seeing if this is an opportunity for maybe a very different kind of a service or subscription kind of a business that's not at all like what they have. And it's hard to sustain that. It's hard to keep it going. And what I love, Bernice, is you're doing an experiment initially. And if the data comes in that this is actually a need we found, it's an opportunity to make a difference for these people and deliver maybe a different kind of service. It's in the stage of generating enough data so it can actually be evaluated vis-a-vis the core activities and the core things. And the question can get asked, you know, if this is important to this individual, it is a different business. It is a different set of skills, you know, but hopefully the experimentation builds enough conviction. You can have the conviction to say, oh, there's something here. If we want to do it, we can decide we don't do it because this isn't the kind of company we are, but we can actually evaluate it. And then the discussion there becomes, what are the many, many ways we could make it a viable business? We could hire a partner to do it. We could experiment with that. We could do it through a third party. We could do it a lot of different ways. And that's the way I would approach it, is just make sure, Bernice, you're really talking about, we just want to evaluate if we found something desirable. That may be valuable for us in all of our lines of business to actually be able to talk about something we found that's a real need. And the other one I thought was interesting, way early on, Karen, you asked a question. I realized we're giving all the examples actually are external facing, that it's this external consumer, and it's, wow, it's really easy at a mall to put stuff in front of consumers because they just are surrounding us, right? If you're the fellow equipment company, you've got loads of people on your website every day, so you can do a little ad for this new service and see who clicks on it. We have loads of examples of internal experimentation though. One that comes to mind was a student a year ago. Phil is on the call with ASI. It was a student in ASI who had an internally facing job, and he figured out that he would put together these bigger meetings, as I recall, and then its attendance wouldn't be good. He couldn't figure out what was going on with getting these particular meetings that were really important to get people together to get through this, whatever content it was. And he started doing simple experimentation around subject lines. He would take 20 of the people and send this subject line, 20 with this subject line, and see how many responded and showed up. And he got a clear sense of, oh, how I'm actually framing up the opportunity to be at this meeting and what people can get out of it is wrong. So he began to do that. And then he did the same thing with different agendas. He would put different agendas out. So a good example of, you can use these tools if you think about desirability as your company or organization as a marketplace, and employees as if they're consumers. This individual is putting different offers out in front of people and just experimenting, is how do I actually do what I'm doing better? How do I make sure it's desirable? How do I make sure, before I put all this effort into thinking there's something wrong with a meeting I'm doing, maybe it's just simple. How do I get everybody to attend the first 5 minutes? And then I'll see from there, how do I make it more compelling?
I've been trying to just have a little comedic relief while you're or comedian relief. I don't know. Steve Martin is a hero, of course. And one of the things that dawned on me in our research process was, wow, comedians are innovators. They're dealing with ideas. They're experimenting rapidly. Jerry Seinfeld talks about keeping his legal pad. Every morning he's writing down material. He's testing it in clubs, etc. And Steve Martin, you can see here, his career began by some enlightened experimentation and new ideas dawned upon him. He was sustained even as he deployed shows for the Kiwanis clubs and Cub Scouts. He was maniacal about gathering feedback and data. And then at the end, at the very height of his fame, he quit because he didn't have the ability to experiment and try new things, and it ended up kind of suffocating him. Which is to say, experimentation is important for inspiration. It's important to sustain an effort, and without it, no humor, at least. I don't know about other things. One point that we want to mention as we conclude the talk today is, and you can do this, there's a simple activity on the New York Times website. There's the link. I may be able to grab this link. Let me see if I can do that.
Can I, one more, I'm going to break in one thing. Chris, thank you. You made a really good comment. How do you know an idea is worth continuously experimenting on or tweaking versus experimenting with a new idea? So one thing I think, and Jeremy, this is something maybe we need to talk about, experiments don't exist in like a bubble on their own. And I think the stories we tell give maybe the impression there was a single experiment. Erica Walsh experimented with many, as in like probably a dozen different concepts. And the data is comparative. So you're able, if you start thinking about doing portfolios of experiments, you begin to see, wow, we can really compare the data. Chris has a really cool startup, and a plug for Chris. If you happen to be a product manager out there, Chris, I've taught you many times, you got to get more users. So here's your chance. While I'm talking, you can recruit for another 30 seconds. But Chris is recruiting product managers, but he's doing all kinds of different experiments with them. And then he can compare the experiments across each other and see what's the conversion of this? How many people use this? And you begin to see the data relative. So that's a great point about experimentation. I think that if you're generating brand new data in this area around this particular need, it's great to have multiple experiments, because then you can see which ones are rising to the top. We have a friend of ours at a company, Pre-Hype. There's a case about really cool. They pioneered these methods using digital tools years and years ago, and they call it signal mining. If you look across it, you can see things sort of begin to pop to get much more engagement around the desirability.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. We look forward to remaining in touch, getting your feedback, and continuing on this learning journey together.